Winter, AD 843, a fjord in western Norway. The air was thick with the smell of iron and sea salt. Snow drifted between the cliffs, settling on the roofs of sod houses. Inside a long wooden hall, the forge burned bright, orange fire licking against the dark. A man worked there alone, hammer rising and falling in rhythm. Sparks leapt like stars. His name was Einar Ketilsson, a blacksmith born of fishermen, with hands burned to leather and eyes grey as the sea. For 3 winters he had laboured on a single obsession, something his neighbours called foolish, even cursed. A ship that could move faster than the wind and sail on water barely deep enough to wet the ankles of a man. They called it Einar's madness. He called it freedom. In those years, the Franks to the south, the empire once ruled by Charlemagne, believed themselves safe. Their kings prayed behind thick stone walls, their armies armoured in chainmail and mounted on horses that never saw the sea. They thought the ocean was a border. They thought rivers were barriers. They thought wrong. Einar's hammer fell again, shaping iron nails on the anvil. The fire hissed. Behind him, the half-finished skeleton of his ship filled the hall. Its ribs of pine curved like the bones of a great serpent. He had designed it differently from all others. Most ships were broad, slow beasts built for carrying goods or cattle. His would be long and narrow, its hull made of thin, overlapping planks, clinker-built, bound by tar and iron rivets. It would glide where others struggled, and it would carry warriors, not farmers. But his greatest trick lay hidden below, the shallow keel, carved so fine that it could sail not only on the open sea, but far up rivers, through waters no Frankish ship could follow. When Einar first described it, even his own chieftain had laughed. "A ship that floats on puddles," he'd said. "Build it then, and sail to heaven." So Einar had built. By the first thaw, the ship was ready. 30 meters long, no taller than a man, light enough to be lifted by 40 hands. Its sides gleamed with pine oil, its dragon-headed prow snarling toward the sea. They called her Hrafn, the Raven. When she slid into the fjord for the first time, the water barely rippled. The villagers fell silent. Einar smiled, the salt wind in his beard. "Now," he said, "let the Franks keep their rivers. We will take their cities." Spring, AD 845, the Seine River, Frankish Empire. The dawn mist lay thick on the water. 40 men rowed in silence, their oars dipping in perfect rhythm. The longship cut through the current like a blade through silk. At the helm stood Ragnar Lothbrok, a war leader of uncertain birth and certain ambition. His beard was plaited, his eyes pale and sharp as steel. He had heard of Einar's ship, the madman's craft that could move faster than a horse on land. Now he commanded it, leading 40 warriors, just 40, up the river toward the richest prize in Francia, Paris. The Franks had no idea he was coming. They had believed themselves untouchable. Their armies waited behind stone walls, their fleets anchored in deep harbours. No one expected the sea to climb their rivers, but Hrafn could. Her shallow hull rode the surface like a gull. The warriors rowed day and night, passing through fog and rain, unseen by scouts. They left no trail, no smoke, only silence. When they reached Rouen, the first Frankish outpost, the soldiers on the walls stared down in disbelief. "Boats," one muttered, "from the sea." Then they saw the dragon-head prow, the line of shields along the rail, and the black-haired men with axes gleaming in the dawn. By the time they raised the alarm, the Norse were already on the walls. They struck like lightning. The gates fell within an hour. The garrison fled into the woods, shouting that demons had come from the north. Ragnar ordered the church looted, the bells melted for silver. He stood before the terrified townsfolk and said, "Tell your king, the sea has no borders." Then, without lingering, he turned his ship upriver, toward Paris itself. In the Frankish capital, Charles the Bald received the first reports with disbelief. 40 men?" he asked his bishop. "A handful of heathens on boats?" "Not boats, sire," the man said, trembling. dragons that move against the river itself." The court laughed. The king did not. He remembered the raids at Nantes, the burned villages along the Loire. He remembered the rumors of ships that could vanish inland like smoke. He sent word for every garrison between Rouen and Paris to arm, knights, spearmen, archers. He promised silver for each Viking head brought to him. He would soon learn that silver was the only thing they wanted. As Hrafen glided toward Paris, the warriors sang low. Half prayer, half challenge. The rhythm of oars echoed through the valley. Ragnar stood at the prow, watching the current twist around the dragon's head. He turned to Einar, who had come along to see his ridiculous invention prove itself. "Did you ever think it would sail so far inland?" Ragnar asked. Einar grinned. "I only thought it should go where men think ships cannot." By the second night, they reached the bend in the river from which the towers of Paris could be seen faintly against the dawn. Behind them, smoke still rose from Rouen and Moulins. Before them, a city of 30,000 souls, defended by walls older than memory. The Franks had gathered an army, thousands of men, armored knights on horseback, banners rippling in the wind. Their lines stretched across the riverbank. Ragnar's men looked at the sight and laughed. One said, "So many, for us?" Another answered, "For their silver." Ragnar turned to Einar. "You made the ship," he said. "Tell me, can she fight them here?" Einar studied the river, the shallows, the bends, the reeds. Then he smiled, a blacksmith smile, forged in defiance. "She can fight anywhere there is water, even if it's only enough to drown pride." At dawn, 40 Vikings rode into battle against the army of a king. Their shields caught the sunlight. The dragon's head rose through the mist. The Franks shouted and charged the riverbank, certain of an easy slaughter. But Hrafen turned sideways, her men leaping ashore in perfect rhythm, light, fast, precise. Before the knights could reach them, arrows and axes filled the air. When the Franks tried to pursue, their horses sank into the mud, while the longship slipped effortlessly back into the current. They struck and vanished, again and again, until the great Frankish host began to crumble in confusion. By dusk, the survivors were fleeing toward Paris, and behind them 40 Vikings rode slowly up the Seine, their laughter echoing through the valley. That night, Ragnar stood beside Einar at the river's edge. The city ahead was silent, its gates barred, its fires dim. He looked at the longship gleaming in torchlight. "Your madness," he said, "has made gods of fishermen." Einar touched the wood of the hull, his creation, his curse, his gift to the north. "Not gods," he said softly, "just men who learned to sail the impossible." March, AD 845, the Seine, outside Paris. Morning fog rolled thick over the river. Bells from the city rang faintly through the mist, a warning that came too late. From the grey light emerged shapes no Frank had ever seen so far inland. 40 long, narrow vessels sliding against the current, each crowned with a snarling dragon. The oars dipped and rose in rhythm, cutting the water with almost no sound. On the walls, a young sentry rubbed his eyes and crossed himself. "Ships," he whispered, "in God's river." The Franks had gathered an army. 4,000 men, knights, foot soldiers and priests clutching relics, lined the banks of the Seine. They waited in formation, confident in their numbers, shining beneath banners of blue and gold. Their leader, Count Odo of Paris, barked orders. "Hold the line, let them land, then crush them. They are 40, no more." He did not yet understand that the battle would not happen on land. The longships drifted closer, slowing, their dragon heads gliding through mist like living things. On the prow of the lead ship stood Ragnar Lothbrok, cloak snapping in the wind. Beside him, Einar the blacksmith, his creation humming softly under the current. 40 against thousands, Ragnar said with a grin. 40 who float where others drown, Einar replied. The Franks unleashed a rain of arrows from the riverbank, but the shafts struck the water or bounced off the curved wooden hulls. The Vikings didn't answer, not yet. They rowed forward, straight into the storm. Then Ragnar raised his axe. "Now!" The front line of longships veered suddenly, turning sideways in the current. Men on deck lifted heavy shields, forming a moving wall of oak and iron. Behind them, archers rose from crouching positions and loosed their arrows low and fast, skipping them across the river's surface like stones. The first volley struck the Franks in the legs and throats. Horses screamed. Men stumbled into the water. It was chaos in seconds. When the Franks charged forward to meet them, the ground betrayed them. The riverbank was mud, deep, sucking, treacherous. The armoured knights sank up to their knees. Their horses floundered. That was when the longships moved. Einar's ridiculous invention, built long and narrow with a shallow keel, could turn on the river like a living creature. Each vessel swung out, slicing across the current, ramming into the bogged-down cavalry from the side. The Vikings leapt from their decks, light and fast, axes flashing. They fought like men possessed, not in ranks but in pairs, moving around the slower knights like wolves around trapped cattle. Within minutes, the riverbank became a slaughter. Count Odo tried to rally his men, hold the high ground, drive them back to the sea. But the sea had already come to him. More longships appeared from the fog, surrounding his flank. One after another, Frankish formations collapsed into panic. The Vikings pressed forward, driving them into the water. Arrows rained again, not high arcs, but direct, brutal shots into faces, joints, gaps between armor. The air filled with screams and the crack of wood on metal. By midday, the Frankish army was broken. Bodies floated down the Seine, their armor gleaming dully in the pale light. The river that had once protected Paris now carried its defenders away. Einar stood on the prow, breathless, staring at the wreckage. "They called this madness," he muttered. Ragnar laughed, wiping blood from his axe. "It still is." That night they camped at Saint-Denis, just a few miles from the city walls. Fires flickered along the riverbank. The men roasted stolen cattle and drank from golden chalices looted that morning. Above them, the black shapes of the longships rocked gently in the current as if alive. Ragnar walked among his men, calm, almost amused. "They said the Franks were too many," he said. They were right. Too many to fit in their graves. Laughter rippled through the camp. Inside Paris, panic spread like plague. The bells rang all night. Priests led processions through the streets, chanting prayers and carrying relics of saints. King Charles the Bold, pale and trembling, demanded to know how the heathens had reached his city. "By the river, my lord," his captain said. "They sail where no ships should sail." Charles clenched his fists. "Then God has forsaken our rivers." And at dawn, the Vikings came again. This time they didn't attack. They simply rode past the walls, hundreds of shields glinting in the morning light. The sight alone was enough. Citizens wept. Priests fainted. Ragnar ordered no arrows fired. He wanted terror to do his work. By noon, the gates of Paris opened. The bishop himself came out under a white banner, bearing a chest of silver. He knelt before Ragnar on the riverbank. "Take this tribute, stranger," he said. "Take it and go." Ragnar studied the man for a long moment. "Tell your king," he said, "that this is not payment. It is rent. The sea will come again." Then he turned to Einar. "Your ship has broken their walls without touching them." As the longships turned downstream, Einar watched the city recede through the mist, the towers of Paris, the chanting of monks, the faint toll of surrender. He had built something that should not exist, and now it would change everything. Ragnar came to stand beside him. "You made us a road," the warlord said, "one that runs through their hearts." Einar said nothing. He only watched the river flow beneath them, dark and calm, carrying the wreckage of the battle away. Word spread across Europe like wildfire. In the monasteries of England, monks wrote trembling in their chronicles, "The Northmen came from the sea, and no fortress could stand against their ships." The Franks paid a king's ransom, more than 7,000 pounds of silver, to make the raiders leave. But silver only fed the hunger. By the next summer, Viking fleets were sailing not only the Seine, but the Loire, the Rhine, the Thames, striking cities hundreds of miles inland. Everywhere they went, they carried Einar's design, the longship that could sail over land's edge. In his forge back in Norway, word reached Einar of what his creation had done. Villagers spoke his name with awe and fear. He returned to the fjord, to the quiet hall where it all began. He sat by the cold forge, staring into the ashes. His son asked him, "Father, will you make another?" Einar replied, "I made one ship. The rest will make themselves now." He looked out to sea, where the horizon glowed faintly red in the distance. The fires of Paris still burned. March 29th, AD 845, the banks of the Seine, Paris. The fog was gone. What replaced it was fire. Columns of smoke climbed into the pale sky as the Viking ships anchored just beyond the walls. From the towers, Parisians could see them clearly now. 40 dragons of oak and iron, each rocking gently in the current as if waiting for some unseen signal. Inside the city, the air reeked of fear. Priests rang the bells until their hands bled. Citizens carried relics through the streets, crying that Judgment Day had come. Children hid in cellars while soldiers dragged carts of stones to the gates. And yet, beyond the walls, the enemy was silent. The longships did not move. Ragnar stood on the prow of Hrafen, arms folded. The river lapped softly at the hull. Beside him, Einar the blacksmith watched the city, eyes narrowed. "She fears us more than we fear her," Ragnar said. Einar grunted. "She should. Fear is the first fire we lit." When dusk fell, Ragnar gathered his men on the shore. Their shields gleamed dull red in the light of burning villages. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will take what their king values most, not just his silver, but his certainty. When he built his walls, he thought they reached the heavens. We will show him that the sea climbs higher." The men murmured agreement, sharpening axes and polishing blades. Einar said nothing. He sat apart, staring at the ships. One of the warriors approached him. "Blacksmith, you forged our path. Will you not fight?" Einar shook his head. "My hammer has already struck. The rest is echo." At dawn, the Vikings moved. They rowed upriver until they faced the city's main bridge, a massive wooden span linking the island of Paris to the northern shore. On the bridge stood a line of Frankish soldiers, spears braced, crossbows ready. Ragnar smiled. He raised his hand, and the longships drifted closer, oars dipping in perfect rhythm. The Franks shouted insults from the bridge. "Barbarians! The king's wrath awaits you!" Ragnar looked to Einar. "How far can your ships leap?" Einar gave a grim smile. "Far enough." The first volley came from the Vikings. Bundles of flaming pitch arced through the air, landing on the bridge. Within seconds, fire crawled along the timbers. The Franks tried to stamp it out, but a gust of wind turned the flames into a wall. As the bridge began to burn, Ragnar ordered his men to row hard. The ships surged forward. The current carried them faster, and the Vikings steered straight beneath the collapsing bridge, through rain and ash and falling embers. The Franks above screamed as the structure cracked and broke, hurling men into the water. In the confusion, the Vikings landed on the southern bank. They came like ghosts through the smoke, faces streaked with ash, axes flashing. The city's defenders, disoriented and terrified, fell before them. Inside the walls, Bishop Goslin rushed to the cathedral, dragging a heavy chest of relics. He knelt before the altar, praying aloud. "Lord, turn the tide, blind the heathens." But outside, the tide was already his enemy. The Seine had become a road of invasion, carrying Ragnar's ships deeper into the heart of Paris. The longships glided right up to the quays, their shallow hulls scraping against the stone. No siege ladders, no towers, just the river itself, lifting the enemy to the gates. By mid-morning, the first barricades fell. The Vikings poured into the lower quarter, breaking open warehouses, setting fires. dragging chests of silver and silk into the streets. Ragnar moved through it all like a man in a dream, calm amid the chaos. "Take what you can carry," he told his men. "Leave the rest to smoke." One of his captains asked, "And the people?" Ragnar's eyes were cold. "They belong to their god. We'll see if he saves them." Einar followed slowly, not as a looter, but as a witness. He had never seen a city like this: stone towers, painted glass, gold on the altar. And yet, under the soot and terror, it was just wood and flesh. A soldier charged at him, sword raised. Einar caught the blade on his hammer and struck once. The man fell, and Einar stared down at him, dazed. The blacksmith whispered, "This is not what I built." By noon, the streets of Paris burned. The longships, tied along the quays, gleamed in the firelight as their crews loaded treasure aboard. The river was choked with debris, broken carts, corpses, and shattered beams from the bridge. Ragnar climbed the steps of the cathedral, looking out over his conquest. Below him, the Seine shone red as blood. He raised his axe high and shouted, "Let the world remember this day! The sea has taken a crown!" His men roared in answer. In the palace, King Charles the Bald was pale with fury. He slammed his fist against the table. "They are animals, filthy pagans!" An adviser knelt before him. "Sire, they demand tribute, 7,000 pounds of silver." 7,000? Madness. "Sire, if we refuse, there will be no Paris left to rule." Charles closed his eyes. The image of his ancestors, emperors and saints, flashed before him. He whispered, "Tell them, we will pay." When the message reached Ragnar, he only laughed. 7,000, he said. "We asked for 5. Einar frowned. "And now?" Ragnar shrugged. "Now they pay for doubting our mercy." He turned to his men. "Load the ships. When the tide changes, we sail with their gold and their fear." 2 days later, the Vikings began their withdrawal. Paris smoldered behind them, its people broken, its king humiliated. On the river, the longships glided in perfect formation, dragonheads reflecting in the current. Each ship carried silver, wine, cloth, and relics, more wealth than any raid in memory. Ragnar stood at the prow of Hrafn, silent. Einar approached, hands black with soot. "You won," the blacksmith said. Ragnar nodded slowly. "Aye, but victory tastes of smoke." As they neared the open sea, a storm gathered. The sky darkened, wind howling down the river. The men grew uneasy. Some whispered that the Christian god was striking back. Ragnar only smiled. "If he sends thunder, it is because he envies our fire." Lightning split the clouds, illuminating the fleet. The dragons roared against the wind. Einar held the rail, feeling the ship rise and fall beneath him. He had built her to master the water, and now she was carrying him home through the wrath of heaven itself. When the storm broke, the horizon opened, the sea vast and cold and endless. The longship spread out across it, sails snapping, oars steady. Einar stood beside Ragnar, both men staring westward. Behind them, France burned. Ahead, Norway waited, rich and wild and silent. Ragnar said softly, "You've changed the world, blacksmith." Einar answered, "No, I only gave it a new shape." And in the monasteries of Europe, the stories grew like plague. They wrote of dragons that sailed on rivers, of 40 men who humbled a king, of ships that came from nowhere and vanished into mist. They called it the miracle of the Northmen. To the Franks, it was terror. To the Vikings, it was proof that the gods still favored the bold. That night, as the fleet vanished into the horizon, Einar sat by the mast, staring at the stars reflected on the water. He thought of the forge, the fire, the first nail he had hammered into the hull of Hrafn. He had meant to build a vessel of freedom. He had built an empire's nightmare. And in the cold wind of the northern sea he whispered, "A hammer cannot choose how it is used." Summer, AD 845, the coast of Norway. The fjords shone like mirrors beneath a pale sun. The longships glided between cliffs heavy with mist, their sails drooping in the still air. Ravens circled above. The sea was calm now, too calm. It carried wealth beyond imagining, chests of Frankish silver, cloth, wine, and relics taken from Paris. To the Vikings aboard, it was triumph. To Einar the blacksmith, it was the sound of something ending. He sat near the prow of Hrafn, hands blackened from the journey, staring at the treasure piled around him. Each chest clinked like a chain. Ragnar came to him, grinning. "We have done what no man dared, burned the heart of a kingdom, and sailed away unchased." Einar didn't answer. Ragnar squatted beside him, voice softer. "What troubles you, smith?" Einar looked toward the horizon. "When I forged her keel, I thought I was shaping freedom. But I see now she's a blade, and I've given it to wolves." Ragnar laughed, though his eyes flickered with unease. "Wolves rule when sheep build walls." They landed at Kaupang, a port crowded with merchants. Word of the Paris raid had already reached the north. Tales of rivers aflame, of kings who paid tribute to 40 men. Crowds gathered along the shore as the fleet returned. Children shouted, women threw flowers, traders offered gold and slaves. Ragnar's men paraded their spoils through the settlement, chalices, tapestries, even the carved doors of a Frankish chapel. The old jarls came forward to greet Ragnar, but when they saw the ships they fell silent. The long, narrow hulls with dragon heads seemed alive, symbols of power beyond their own. One elder, Jarl Sigurd of Trøndelag, touched the hull of Hrafn with awe. "This ship," he said, "she is not of men, but of the gods." Ragnar shook his head. "She is of a blacksmith's madness." Einar corrected him quietly. "Of wood and water, nothing more." But even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. The ship had become more than wood. It was an idea. And ideas travel faster than ships. Months passed. New ships were built, hundreds of them. Every jarl wanted his own fleet. Every young man wanted to follow Ragnar's path to glory. Einar watched from his forge as apprentices copied his designs. The overlapping planks, the shallow keel, the dragon prow that cut through waves. The sound of hammers filled the fjord. One day, a young smith brought him a hull plan. "Master, can we make it longer? For 60 men instead of 40? Einar's face hardened. "For what?" "For England, perhaps," the boy said. "Or Ireland. The Franks have no gold left." Einar turned away. "Make it shorter. The longer the ship, the longer the shadow it casts." The boy did not understand. He left, shaking his head. In Paris, the wounds still smoked. King Charles the Bald sat in his hall surrounded by silence. The treasury was nearly empty. The people cursed him for weakness. His nobles whispered of rebellion. When an advisor urged him to rebuild the bridge, Charles struck the table. "No bridge," he said, "no gate, no wall will hold back the sea." Instead, he issued decrees. River guards, watchtowers, fortifications along the Seine. But none of it mattered. Within a year, the Vikings were back. Different leaders, same ships. This time they didn't sack the city. They collected tribute and left. Payment for peace, a peace that never lasted. The empire that Charlemagne had built was dying, not by sword, but by erosion. Across Europe, panic became policy. Kings began to build their own navies, small fleets designed to patrol rivers. The Franks hired mercenaries, sometimes even Vikings, to defend their coasts. Churches moved relics inland. Monasteries built stone towers instead of wooden spires. The map of power shifted quietly, like sand under tide. Where once a horse had been the symbol of might, now it was the ship. And every ship carried Einar's ghost. Back in Norway, Ragnar grew restless. He was no longer satisfied with raids and tribute. He dreamed of kingdoms, of carving out his own domain across the sea. But the more his fame grew, the more dangerous it became. One night he came to Einar's forge. The firelight flickered across their faces. "I need more ships," Ragnar said. "Faster, stronger. The English kings are rich, and they will not pay tribute forever." Einar didn't look up from his work. "You have all you need." Ragnar leaned closer. "Do I? Or have you lost your fire, Smith?" Einar met his eyes. "I haven't lost it. I've learned what it burns." The silence between them was long and heavy. Finally, Ragnar smiled, not kindly. "Then I'll find another who hasn't." He left without another word. Within a season, a dozen rival jarls were building fleets based on Hrafn's design. Raids spread across the coasts of Europe. Hamburg burned, Nantes fell. The silver of the Franks flowed north like a river that would never stop, and Einar's name, once praised, began to vanish beneath the fame of the warlords. He withdrew deeper into the fjord, working in silence. When young smiths came seeking instruction, he sent them away. "I built one ship too well," he would say. "That is enough for a lifetime." But history has no breaks. By the end of the century, Viking fleets numbered in the hundreds. They didn't just raid, they settled, built towns, founded kingdoms from Ireland to Kiev. The longship had become the engine of empire. What Einar forged for 40 men now carried nations, and the Franks, who once ruled the world with castles and cavalry, found their borders drawn not by walls, but by tides. Years later, an old man came to Einar's hut, a messenger from the south. He brought a parchment sealed in wax, bearing the mark of a Frankish abbot. Einar broke the seal and read. It was a plea written in Latin asking him to come to Francia to build ships for them. "They will pay in silver," the messenger said. Einar stared at the letter for a long time. "Tell your masters," he said finally. "I already did. Once." He tossed the parchment into the forge. It burned quickly. As he watched the flames, he thought of Ragnar, the warrior who had sailed into legend. Stories said he had been captured by a foreign king, thrown into a pit of snakes and died laughing. But legends are only shadows. What mattered was the trail he left, and behind that trail the rivers of Europe still shimmered with dragons. The night wind howled down the fjord. Einar walked to the shore where Hrafn rested, half buried in sand and seaweed. Her hull was cracked, her dragon head rotting. He touched the wood with trembling fingers. "You carried them farther than I ever dreamed," he whispered, "but I wonder if the sea remembers their names." A wave broke gently against the hull. He turned and walked back toward the forge. The coals inside glowed faintly, like the last heartbeat of a god. Norway, late winter, AD 870. The fjord was frozen in silence. The mountains rose black against the snow, and the wind carried the sound of waves beneath the ice, faint like a heartbeat buried in time. In a hut by the shore, an old man sat beside the dying embers of a forge. The tools hung cold on the walls, and dust lay on the anvil. It was Einar, the blacksmith, once the madman of the north, now a name fading into legend. Before him, the forge that had changed the world slept like a spent volcano. He stared into the last coals and whispered, "I built a ship to make men free. I gave them a way to roam, and they learned how to rule." Outside, the sea answered with a whisper of its own. Across the world he had helped awaken. The echoes of that whisper had become thunder. The Franks, once rulers of the continent, now paid tribute to Viking jarls who settled their rivers. The English built fleets of their own, copying Norse designs plank by plank. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, longships traced dark lines of smoke and silver. Rivers turned into roads, coasts turned into maps. A new age was rising, one of sails and axes, of trade and conquest. But it was not just war that travelled with the longship, it was change. In Paris, the scars still showed. The city had rebuilt, its churches taller, its bridges stronger. But every child grew up knowing the story of the dragons that came from the sea. 40 ships against an empire. The chroniclers no longer called it a raid, they called it a lesson. "The sea is a sword with no master," one monk wrote, "and those who think land will save them have already lost." From that fear came something unexpected: unity. The Franks began to gather under stronger kings to build the foundations of what would one day be France. In their terror, they learned organization. The age of the longship had destroyed kingdoms and forged others. In England, too, the pattern repeated. Viking fleets didn't just plunder, they stayed. They built settlements at York and Dublin, mingled with locals, traded furs for wheat, iron for gold. Their children grew up speaking two tongues, Norse and Saxon, the roots of a new language that would one day be English. By the time Einar's beard turned white, his design had carried not just warriors, but farmers, traders, and dreamers across the known world. The longship, once born in secrecy, had become the engine of civilization. But every gift casts a shadow. Where the Vikings went, the gods of the old world followed. Temples burned, monks fled, and Europe was forced to choose between fear and faith. Some said it was punishment, others called it renewal. The church, nearly broken, hardened in response, sending missionaries north, baptizing kings, weaving new stories to tame old ones. In time, the Norse gods fell silent. Thor's hammer gave way to the cross, and with that silence came the end of Einar's world. One spring morning, Einar walked to the shore. The ice had melted, the sea was alive again. A new fleet waited in the harbor, sleek ships larger than his first, painted with strange new symbols. The young men who crewed them wore crosses around their necks. They saluted him respectfully as they worked, calling him Master Smith, though few knew his story anymore. He watched as they pushed the ships into the tide, laughing, fearless. They weren't raiders now. They were explorers, bound west for lands no one had seen. The blacksmith smiled faintly. "So that's what comes next," he murmured. "The sea never ends, only the reasons for sailing it." In the years that followed, rumors drifted back from the horizon, of strange coasts, vast islands, new worlds of ice and green forest. The same ships that had burned Paris now carried settlers and traders to unknown shores. Einar's ridiculous invention had outlived its creator's intent and its creator's lifetime. What had begun as a weapon had become a bridge. A century later, chroniclers would still write his name in the margins of sagas. Some called him Einar Firehand. Others said he had been taught by the gods or by a demon trapped in iron. But the truth was simpler. He was a man who had looked at water and seen possibility. In the north, the sagas changed their tone. They no longer sang only of battles and raids, but of journeys. Iceland, Greenland, Vinland. The dragon ships that once carried war now carried discovery. And beneath each plank, each rivet, each curve of the hull, Einar's touch remained. In his final days, Einar returned to the cliff above his fjord. Below him, the tide rolled in and out, eternal, patient. He thought of Ragnar and the fire of Paris, of the gold that burned brighter than faith, of the forges that had copied his work across the world. A gull circled overhead, crying out against the wind. He smiled and whispered to it, "You and I, we were born to chase horizons." Then he closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the sea filling the silence. Centuries passed. The world changed again. Castles rose, gunpowder spoke, and sails grew taller than trees. But the principles of Einar's ship, the shallow draught, the strong frame, the unity of craft and courage, lived on in every vessel that braved ashore. Every navy, every explorer, every captain who looked at a river and thought perhaps we can go farther, was a child of that forge. Even now, when modern ships trace their paths across the same waters, the sea remembers. Sometimes in the cold dawn fog, fishermen claim they see it, a shadow of a long, narrow shape, gliding silently beneath the surface, dragon-headed, eternal. And they say that if you listen closely, you can still hear a hammer strike in the depths, Once, twice, as if the blacksmith of the north still works, shaping the impossible. Einar Ketilsson died nameless. His invention did not. The longship became the spine of the Viking age, the seed of European exploration, and the vessel that carried humanity from isolation to expansion. He had not meant to change the world, but the world rarely asks permission from its makers. So the sea kept its promise. It gave power to those who dared to move and swallowed those who tried to stand still. And in the end, that was Einar's legacy, not the ship itself, but the idea that nothing sacred lies beyond reach, that even the impossible can float, if forged with enough fire.